regenerating nature becomes very much this concept of how do we start to look at the underlying natural system because our lives depend on it.
Hi, and welcome again to another episode of Infrastructure Connections, the podcast where we explore what makes sustainable infrastructure work, brought to you by the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I'm your host, Rebecca Santiago, and today we'll be speaking about regenerative nature with Georgine Roodenrys. Georgine is a respected leader in regenerative industrial development with deep expertise in climate strategy, circular economy, and decarbonisation. Georgine is a director at Rennie, where she advises clients on navigating that complex transition to a low-carbon economy by integrating innovation, sustainability, and human progress. Her work spans emerging green technologies, such as hydrogen and low-carbon fuels. And she also drives systemic change through the design and delivery of transformative climate and sustainability initiatives. Georgine, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Really great topic. So look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And before we jump into today's topic, regenerate nature, let's start from your journey. So what sparked your interest in sustainability?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Look, it's been a lifelong journey for me. I was really lucky to have been inspired by my grandparents. They established something called the Burrendong Arboretum, which is in New South Wales. It was developed in the 60s, but from an idea in the 30s from my great uncle George. And it was fairly radical at the time. It was to take a whole pile of sheep grazing land and to restore that to nature and to make it a place for the, protection of native Australian species. The Burrendong Arboretum is still there, and at its sort of peak, it was the third largest arboretum in the world, and it's a beautiful place and one I can recommend that people visit. But it's very much shaped my career and my studies, and so I'm really grateful for that inspiration.
Beautiful. It's always really inspiring and also interesting to hear where people's sustainability journey started. Okay, so now let's zoom in into one of your early leadership roles. So that was the circular economy strategy in Queensland. You were right there involved. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, look, I was very, very privileged to lead the climate team in Queensland during the last Labor government, and it was a really, really interesting time. We were working very much on making sort of climate change a key economic issue for the state, and that sort of logic and thinking as we did whole of economy sort of climate change work was sort of deeply embedded, and inevitably when you start to look at some of your key sectors, particularly around built environment, you really start to think about sort of circular economy principles. What we desperately were trying to do was ensure that circular economy just wasn't tagged to the waste agenda entirely, and to really sort of, because it was so fundamental to our ability to deliver on our climate change goals. I mean, if you take the Ellen MacArthur Foundation perspective, 45% of emissions of any economy are the inputs sort of within that economy, which only really circular economy strategies can resolve. So it was fairly vital. But look, there's some of the question is around the systems thinking, I guess, that we need for circular economy, and that's really sort of challenging in government. In theory, you've got all of the ingredients for governments to be extraordinary in terms of systems thinking, simply because they've got every aspect, whether it's sort of the societal or the environmental or the economic, they have expertise in all of those areas. But, sort of you really get killed like everywhere in terms of the ability to think within a long-term perspective. The immediate problems are so demanding. Everyone is so reactive. There's very little space for people to step above that to do the long term or think to a different horizon and start to think about how we get ahead of issues rather than just keep repeating the same old, So it's an interesting place. That said, I think government has huge potential to be extraordinary in leading sort of circular thinking throughout the portfolio of government. By taking a scenario sort of planning view in terms of where is it we want to be as a society, what do we want our environment to look like, by 2050, what do we socially strive to look like, and really setting goals that are broader than just the economic sort of targets that we have for ourselves. And then if we then cross-fertilise those targets so that every agency is responsible on delivering sort of environmental, social, economic outcomes, you would start to get that better integration of thinking and the ability to start integrating things like circular economy principles. So it's an interesting place. Challenging, but I think all of these states are doing such good work in leaning into these adoption of things like circular economy, as well as sort of deep climate change programs that are really shifting the dial.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and that highlights how we've been rethinking systems, looking at how materials, resources, and industries are now interacting to reduce waste. But now we're seeing a shift on how that's taking a further step, and that's where regeneration comes in.
Yeah.
How would you define regenerate nature?
Yeah. So look, I've been doing a bit in the regeneration of nature. I've also done a lot of thinking around regenerative economy. Very different concepts. So, if listeners are thinking, is that the same as regenerative economy? It's not. Regenerate nature is the regeneration of nature. A regenerative economy is where you start to say, well, we have an economy. It's based on a whole pile of metrics. GDP is the sort of defining metric of a country, I suppose. But you look at the economy and you say, well, by all sort of measures, in terms of equality of people and the situation of our environment, the economy seems to be sort of delivering us sort of suboptimal outcomes, if that makes sense, based on our current metrics. And, some of the tragedy is that, there is our GDP is positively impacted by activity within the economy. So, a car crash is an economic positive in terms of the economy. People's illness is a positive economic consequence for the economy, and so the rational logic of economics is, by its inherent nature, sort of not regenerating us as a society and in our environment. And so how would we think about changing that, the metrics within our economy, so that the economy is in fact serving the things we need, such as society and the environment? In theory, your economy is in service of those things, not driving. It isn't the objective in and of itself. It's meant to be in service of. The regeneration of nature, though, is very much the third sort of principle of circular economy. At the end of the day, our economic modelling of the world is blind to the fact that resources on Earth are finite. It just assumes that there's resources that can keep being put in to the economic model, and we keep making goods and services, and it spits it out the other end. And we just know that this isn't, this is a fiction to some extent. It's how we operate, but it's effectively a fiction. We've only got one planet, only so many resources, and we can't keep creating such a mess because we're all getting sick and our ecosystems are in poor shape. So, what the principles of circular economy say is, firstly, you've got to look at what goes into our economic system, and we've got to stop putting in finite things that we can't replace, so finite resources. So we have to flick as many of those to renewable resources. The most easily to understand is obviously energy in terms of fossil fuels versus renewable energy. But at the end of the day, to create renewable energy, we are also using mineral resources. So there's trade-offs there. So trying to reduce the dependence on finite, and then if we have to use finite resources, how do we limit those as much as possible? So how we just reduce the big pipe coming into the economic system by being, designing stuff out, being more efficient, really querying if we need new. Then once all those materials are in the system, we want to, recirculate and keep those things in the system for as long as possible so that we don't have to keep demanding new materials into the system. And so that's all of, your circular sort of business models. But on the other end of that, there's no point doing all of that if our natural systems are still under threat. And so regenerating nature obviously has to become a key third element. And it's often missed out. Practitioners can be excused for not kind of realising that it is the third pillar. I mean, I was just even looking at the Green Business Council CEFC guideline on circular economy principles for buildings, for example, and nature is not mentioned. It really is looking at the building in isolation. And I guess, the point is, if we keep building buildings all within their own sort of ecosystem and don't think about the broader impacts on nature of this infrastructure, that, we're just going to build ourselves to oblivion. So, regenerating nature becomes very much this concept of how do we start to look at the underlying natural system because our lives depend on it.
How do you see global efforts influencing the way Australia approaches to regeneration more broadly?
I think it's really important for people to understand that there's just a massive tension in development between action on climate change and what we need to do for nature. The problem we've got is that if we move rapidly to decarbonise without regenerating nature, we may get to net zero, but we won't be any better off because our natural systems will have been destroyed, and so human life is not sort of tenable anyway. If we halt climate change activity, and that includes massive industrialisation to protect nature and restore nature, again, untenable. So, we've got to get sort of to this top position, which is, reducing, sort of managing or mitigating climate change as hard as we can while regenerating nature as fast as we can. That's where we've got to get to really, really quickly. And so therefore, you have to really rethink your entire system, including planning approvals, the conditioning that you put on sort of licensing for industry to undertake particular activities. We just need to really think differently, and we've got to move both at pace and scale. And that's a real challenge. So I sort of think that there are really good pockets in the US, in Europe, where we've seen really good examples of, digitisation of permitting processes, use of digital assets to really be able to get good understanding of natural capital assets, starting to move away from really traditional approaches such as the environmental impact statement, which, costs a lot of money, doesn't really give you a very good outcome in terms of thinking about regeneration of nature and the context of assets. So, there are some really good things we can be looking at, I think.
There's several terms floating around in this space. And for our listeners who might be new to the topic, can you help us understand the difference between regenerate nature and nature positive?
Nature positive is a global, has been established as a global goal. It's the big system. It's how can human beings live, restore its natural capital to a healthy place, and to do that. And I think in the global context, there's been a baseline of 2020. So let's have a look at the natural environment at 2020. Can we at least restore nature to the baseline, and then have it fully restored by 2050. And when we talk about regenerate nature, we're talking specifically about the regeneration of particular ecosystems. So, when we scale that down on a sort of an infrastructure sort of level, it is the nature that sits within that context. And so how do we think about that? If you are looking from a nature positive perspective, you're looking at those broader goals I was talking about in terms of the overall impact of your infrastructure sort of on global ecosystems, and how can we do that better, for example.
Thank you. So we can say that nature positive is the ultimate goal, and regenerating nature is the path to achieve that.
Yeah. And I think, Rebecca, just in this context, I think sometimes people, really scratch their heads. We sit around in Australia, which is remarkable, and a lot of us sit sort of in coastal cities, and we see beautiful nature all the time. But I think if there's two statistics that people can hold in mind, is that at the moment we have the highest extinction rates in the world, Australia. Some extraordinary extinctions. So we are one of the largest extinction rates in the world. Also, between 2000 and 2017, we cleared 7.7 million hectares of potential habitat for threatened species. I think that's a number that people really need to soak up, because we so like to blame previous generations for some of this environmental damage. But this is our generation. This is 2000 to 2017. That's within, our working lives. We have cleared 7.7 million hectares, and that wasn't referred to the EPBC. So, we have a significant issue in this country. It's huge impact, and, we need to be aware of what is driving this thinking in places like Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now we need to focus on the positive of the next steps.
Yeah, exactly.
So we talked about the difference between those two concepts. Now, what are some common misconceptions that you encounter when talking about regeneration?
The biggest conundrum people have in thinking about this issue is why it's so hard. And it is worth, and I've touched on it before, but at the end of the day, the incentives that are hardwired into our economy make this very, very difficult to do. When you get down to a spreadsheet that is looking at the cost of infrastructure, and you're trying to get rid of 10 to 20% of those costs to even bring it into an envelope that can be contemplated, then it is very, very difficult to make the case, because our economic system, which is requiring you to work that out in a spreadsheet, is not taking into account, first of all, the impact or cost of these things to future generations. So if we don't constrain ourselves, if we don't innovate and try and get efficiencies in our use of nature into the existing environment, then the impact is simply borne by future generations. And I think we just keep going through the process of, getting the order down for infrastructure, doing the business case, and then really just churning through the traditional approaches. We can already stop at that point and really just open up our minds to what other conversations should be had around this infrastructure, and how could we just do this differently to even get one positive environmental impact that we wouldn't otherwise have had. Just even demonstrating by doing, I think, is really, really important.
It still feels like regeneration is not quite in the front and center yet.
No.
From your perspective, what are some changes in the policy or even the procurement that could help push it forward?
On the infrastructure side, people have to do their material flows. They have to understand the materials that are going into their infrastructure. They've got to think about where those materials are. They've got to understand the nature impacts. So, TNFD sort of approaches to sort of saying, well, what's the nature impact of all those materials? Where am I at risk? What are the ways that I can think about these materials, and how do I make better choices? I'm using EPDs, using whole of, there's, planet price, evaluations of whole of sort of social environmental impact. they've got to apply circular principles to work out how to reduce using those, and then once they've got them, to keep them in sync as long as possible. Space has to be made for somebody in those organisations to have bigger conversations about what is going on in the ecosystem. This piece of infrastructure is going in this place. What else is going on in this place, and how can we tie these things together to get better outcomes, and particularly on a nature from a nature perspective. You've got a whole pile of groups of people who are trying to restore nature and be involved. Sometimes they just need a sponsor, an excuse to be able to draw funding in. How is it that you can use your influence and the power of the project to drive bigger and more systemic change? So, I think there's so much that can be done even within the existing sort of envelope of what we've been given to do, but we've got to want to do it.
Thank you. That is very inspiring. Georgine, before we wrap up, for our listeners who many sustainability professionals, what's one action they can take, they can embed in terms of regenerative nature into their next project?
Yeah. I would say that if I was going to do anything, I'd reach out to an alliance partner. So I'd reach out to, wherever the next project is, and I would always go place-based. To be honest, so maybe get organisationally get a partner, a not-for-profit environmental partner or a not-for-profit social partner, where you can bounce off ideas and get different thinking into the tent. I mean, I think that's really, really important, hearing those different voices. I think, though, as soon as you have place in terms of a project, then, bringing together, a broad church to have a conversation about how to think differently about these issues, really getting an ear on the ground in terms of what other parts of the economy and the community are trying to do. What are their other broader aspirations? Is there a riverine project that they're trying to get up? Is there a reforestation piece that they've been trying to do for ages? Is there a waterway that's caused massive problems and that really needs to be fixed? So how could some issue in the community be enhanced through merely your presence building a piece of infrastructure in that place? I think if you could, sort of connect to one community, society, place-based issue that is outside your normal thinking of infrastructure, you would have significantly enhanced the benefit of the infrastructure that you're delivering.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Georgine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and connect with us on socials. We would love to hear your thoughts. Your feedback helps shape the conversations we bring to life. Stay tuned to our next episode.